How good is your history knowledge? Test yourself with this 40-question quiz and see how many you can get right. Stay until the end and comment your score to challenge others. Ready? Let's begin. What year did the Cold War start? 1945, 1947, or 1950? (1947). The Cold War began after World War II in 1947. Which two superpowers were involved? USA and USSR, China and USA, or USSR and Germany? USA and USSR. The USA and USSR were the main rivals during the Cold War. What was the purpose of NATO? To counter Soviet threats, to promote peace in Asia, or to expand communism? To counter Soviet threats. NATO was created to defend against the Soviet Union. What caused the Cuban Missile Crisis? Soviet missiles in Cuba, USA missiles in Turkey, or Berlin Wall construction? Soviet missiles in Cuba. The USSR placed missiles in Cuba, causing a standoff. What was the Berlin Wall's purpose? To divide East and West Berlin, to protect from invaders, or to divide Germany? To divide East and West Berlin. The Berlin Wall separated Communist East from capitalist West. Who led the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, or Mikhail Gorbachev? Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev was the leader during the crisis in 1962. What year did the Berlin Wall fall? 1987, 1989, or 1991? (1989). The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, symbolizing the end of the Cold War. What was the main goal of the Truman Doctrine? To prevent communism spread, to support democracy, or to establish NATO? To prevent communism spread. The Truman Doctrine aimed to stop the spread of communism. What was the primary cause of the Korean War? North Korea's invasion of the South, Soviet support for North Korea, or China's involvement? North Korea's invasion of the South. North Korea's invasion in 1950 led to U.S. involvement. What was the name of the Soviet alliance during the Cold War? Warsaw Pact, League of Nations, or SEATO? Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was formed to counter NATO during the Cold War. What is the space race? A competition between USA and USSR in space exploration, a military battle for control of the skies, or a space treaty between countries? A competition between USA and USSR in the space race was a competition to dominate space technology. Who was the U.S. president during the Cuban Missile Crisis? John F. Kennedy, Dwight D. Eisenhower, or Lyndon B. Johnson? John F. Kennedy. Kennedy led the U.S. through the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. What was the outcome of the Vietnam War? North Vietnam won, South Vietnam won, or the US withdrew with a stalemate? North Vietnam won. North Vietnam unified the country under communist rule. What was the Cuban Revolution? A communist overthrow of the government, a war with the US, or a political movement in Africa? A communist overthrow of the government. The Cuban Revolution overthrew Fulgencio Batista's regime in 1959. What was the Iron Curtain? A barrier between communist and non-communist Europe, a wall between East and West Germany, or a Soviet military base? A barrier between communist and non-communist Europe. The Iron Curtain separated Eastern Europe under Soviet control from Western Europe. What year did the Soviet Union collapse? 1991, 1989, or 1995? (1991). The Soviet Union officially dissolved in 1991, ending the Cold War. What event brought the US and USSR closest to nuclear war? Cuban Missile Crisis, Berlin Crisis, or Korean War? Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was the closest the Cold War came to nuclear conflict. What was the purpose of the SALT treaties? To limit nuclear weapons, to prevent the spread of communism, or to create economic sanctions? To limit nuclear weapons. The SALT treaties were designed to limit the number of nuclear weapons held by the US and USSR. What was the domino theory? The belief that if one country fell to communism, others would follow. The theory of space exploration, or the belief in free trade. The belief that if one country fell to communism, others would follow. The domino theory was the belief that communism would spread across countries like falling dominoes. What marked the official end of the Cold War? The collapse of the Soviet Union, the signing of the Berlin Agreement, or the Cuban Missile Crisis? The collapse of the Soviet Union. The end of the Cold War came with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Which U.S. president initiated the policy of containment? Harry S. Truman, John F. Kennedy, or Dwight D. Eisenhower? Harry S. Truman. Did you know Truman's containment policy aimed to prevent the spread of communism, particularly in Europe? What was the main goal of the U.S. policy during the Vietnam War? To stop the spread of communism, to promote democracy, or to defend South Korea? To stop the spread of communism. The U.S. intervened in Vietnam to prevent communism from spreading in Southeast Asia. What was the name of the operation in which the U.S. helped supply West Berlin during the Soviet blockade? The Berlin Airlift, the Normandy Invasion, or Operation Desert Storm? The Berlin Airlift. Did you know the Berlin Airlift in 1948 supplied West Berlin with food and supplies after the Soviets blockaded the city? What was the significance of the Korean War? It was the first major proxy war of the Cold War. It ended with a peace treaty, or it led to the unification of Korea. It was the first major proxy war of the Cold War. The Korean War marked the first direct military conflict between the US and communist forces during the Cold War. Which event led to the division of Germany into East and West? The end of World War II, the Berlin Airlift, or the Cuban Missile Crisis? The end of World War II. After World War II, Germany was divided into zones controlled by the Allies, leading to the division of the country into East and West. Who was the leader of the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Nikita Khrushchev, Joseph Stalin, or Leonid Brezhnev? Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev was the Soviet leader during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Which country was divided after World War II and became a focal point of Cold War tension? Germany, Japan, or Korea? Germany. Germany was divided into East and West, with the Soviet Union controlling the East and the US, France, and Britain controlling the West. What was the name of the US strategy to prevent Soviet influence in Europe after World War II? The Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, or the Berlin Wall? The Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was an economic initiative by the U.S. to help Western European countries rebuild after World War II and resist communism. What was the main goal of the SALT treaties between the U.S. and the Soviet Union? To limit nuclear weapons, to promote global peace, or to establish NATO? To limit nuclear weapons. SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, was aimed at limiting the number of nuclear weapons held by the US and the Soviet Union. What was the domino theory during the Cold War? The idea that if one country became communist, others would follow. The belief in nuclear war, or the theory of peaceful coexistence. The idea that if one country became communist, others would follow, held that the spread of communism would lead to the spread of communism in neighboring countries. What was the main objective of the Cuban Revolution? To overthrow the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista, to create a communist government, or to improve US-Cuban relations? To overthrow the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. Fidel Castro led the Cuban Revolution in 1959 to overthrow Batista's dictatorship and establish a communist government. What was the result of the Korean War? Korea remained divided into North and South. The war ended in a complete victory for the South, or the North conquered the South. Korea remained divided into North and South. The Korean War ended in 1953 with an armistice, leaving Korea divided into Communist North Korea and Capitalist South Korea. Who was the first man in space during the Cold War? Yuri Gagarin, Neil Armstrong, or Alan Shepard? Yuri Gagarin. Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet cosmonaut, became the first person to orbit the Earth in 1961. What was the significance of the Berlin Wall? It divided East and West Berlin. It separated North and South Korea, or it symbolized the Iron Curtain. It divided East and West Berlin. The Berlin Wall, built in 1961, physically separated East Berlin, communist, from West Berlin, capitalist. What was the main purpose of the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War? To prevent the spread of communism, to defend South Korea, or to establish democracy in Southeast Asia? To prevent the spread of communism. The U.S. entered the Vietnam War to prevent communism from spreading in Southeast Asia. What year did the Berlin Wall fall? 1989, 1987, or 1991? (1989). The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked the end of the division of Germany and the Cold War. What is the Cuban Missile Crisis most remembered for? The threat of nuclear war, the building of the Berlin Wall, or the end of the Vietnam War? The threat of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the U.S. and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war in 1962. What was the role of the United Nations during the Cold War? To mediate conflicts and promote peace, to support the Soviet Union, or to end the Vietnam War? To mediate conflicts and promote peace. The United Nations aimed to prevent war and mediate conflicts during the Cold War. Which U.S. policy was used to aid countries resisting communism? The Truman Doctrine, the Eisenhower Doctrine, or the Monroe Doctrine? The Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine aimed to provide military and economic support to countries resisting communism. What was the result of the space race? The U.S. landed on the moon first. The Soviet Union won the first space flight. Or both countries built space stations. The U.S. landed on the moon first. The U.S. won the space race by landing the first man on the moon in 1969. Thank you. See you next time. Goodbye.